After returning from service to a burned-down farm and the suspicious death of his father, veteran Lucas Grayson had only one companion left, Blade, a loyal German shepherd who had grown wild. One evening, Blade led him to an old concrete foundation and began clawing frantically at the hard stone. Its eyes were filled with a desperate urgency, as if trying to reveal a buried secret that only it knew. What could be buried beneath this concrete? So important that a loyal dog would try to tear through stone to expose it. Lucas suspected the truth hidden beneath was even more dangerous than the fire that took everything from him. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The scent of ash clung to everything, a perpetual ghost of what once was. It invaded Lucas Grayson's nostrils, coating his tongue, clinging to his worn army fatigues even after he'd changed out of them. He'd arrived in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in June 2018, the Idaho sun beating down mercilessly on the scorched earth. 6 years, 6 long years since he'd last set foot on the family farm, since he'd last hugged his father, Robert Grayson, a man whose hands were as weathered as the land he tirelessly worked. Now, all that remained was a skeletal framework of charred timbers and the ghosts of memories. Lucas Grayson was a man carved from duty and hardship. At 32 years old, his face, usually set in a determined line, was now etched with a profound weariness that belied his age. His short-cropped, dark hair was dusted with fine gray ash, mirroring the desolation around him. A veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers, his physique was lean, powerful, and efficient, a testament to years of rigorous training and combat. But beneath the hardened exterior, his eyes, a startling shade of hazel, held a vulnerability, now intensified by grief and a growing sense of unease. He carried himself with a quiet intensity, always observing, always assessing, a habit forged in environments where a moment's inattention could cost a life. His combat boots, scuffed and familiar, crunched on the gravel path that once led to a welcoming porch. Now, they led only to sorrow. He paused by the remains of the old farmhouse, a knot tightening in his stomach. The familiar warmth, the scent of his mother's baking that lingered even years after her passing, the faint aroma of his father's pipe tobacco, all had been violently replaced by the acrid stench of destruction. A yellow police tape, faded by the sun, still fluttered half-heartedly across a section of what used to be the barn. No one had bothered to take it down. No one, it seemed, had bothered with much at all since the fire. A gruff voice broke the suffocating silence. "Mr. Grayson?" Lucas Grayson? Lucas turned, his hand instinctively going to his hip, a phantom holster on his side. Standing a few feet away was Sheriff Morgan, a man in his late 50s with a potbelly straining against his uniform shirt and a perpetually tired look in his eyes. Sheriff Morgan had been the law in Owyhee County for as long as Lucas could remember, a fixture of the sleepy rural community. He wasn't overtly hostile, but there was an unreadable quality in his gaze, a mix of professionalism and something else, something subtly off-key. "Sheriff," Lucas acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "I came as soon as I heard." "Took you long enough," Sheriff Morgan replied, though his tone lacked real malice. "Fire was almost 3 weeks ago, August 2018. Your father—" He trailed off, looking vaguely uncomfortable. "He didn't make it. Burned alive in the house, according to the fire marshal's report. Tragic accident. Faulty wiring in the old barn." Lucas's jaw tightened. "An accident? My father was meticulous. He checked every inch of this place twice a year. Faulty wiring? He just replaced half the system last spring." Sheriff Morgan shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes of dismissal. "Reports say otherwise, Mr. Grayson. We've done our due diligence, inspected the site, interviewed the neighbors, concluded it was an accidental electrical fire. Case closed as far as the county is concerned. He avoided Lucas's direct gaze, instead focusing on a distant tumbleweed rolling across the parched fields. "I understand you're grieving. It's a tough loss. Robert was a good man." The words felt hollow, like pebbles clattering on glass. Lucas sensed an almost desperate desire from the sheriff to close this chapter, to sweep the ashes under the rug. "Did you find anything? Anything at all that might suggest otherwise?" "Nothing, son. Just a sad, unfortunate incident." Sheriff Morgan shifted his weight, his eyes finally meeting Lucas's, but only for a fleeting second. "Look, the insurance company's been calling. They'll want to talk to you, and you'll need to figure out what to do with this land." He gestured vaguely at the expanse of charred fields and scorched earth. "It's not looking good, Lucas. Not good at all." He offered a perfunctory nod, then turned and lumbered back to his patrol vehicle, leaving Lucas standing amidst the desolation, the sheriff's words echoing in the oppressive silence. Case closed. But for Lucas, it felt like the case had barely begun. The sun began its slow descent, painting the Idaho sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the monochrome of destruction below. Lucas walked aimlessly across the land his family had owned for generations. His boots kicked up dust and fragments of what used to be his home. He remembered playing here as a boy, running through fields of golden wheat, his father's hearty laugh echoing across the expanse. Now there was only the wind, whispering through dead stalks. As he reached the farthest edge of the property, near a cluster of scraggly junipers that had somehow escaped the worst of the fire, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, his ranger training kicking in, his senses on high alert. Observing him from a distance of about 30 yards, partially concealed by the thin foliage, was a dog. A magnificent German shepherd, its coat a striking blend of gray and white, almost ghost-like against the muted landscape. It was undeniably a purebred, probably around 6 or 7 years old, with intelligent, piercing golden brown eyes. Its posture was one of extreme caution and distrust, its body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. This wasn't a stray that had simply wandered onto the property. This dog had an air of purpose, a quiet strength, but also a deep, palpable fear of human proximity. Lucas's breath hitched. He knew that dog. He hadn't seen it in years, but the distinctive markings, the way it carried itself, it had to be. "Blade," he whispered, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so long. Blade was Robert Grayson's dog, or at least Lucas believed it was. His father had always had a German shepherd, a loyal companion. But this one looked different, more wild, more wary. It had disappeared shortly after Lucas had left for the army in 2012, or so his father had vaguely mentioned in a letter, saying Blade had run off. Now, seeing it here amidst the ruins, watching him with such intensity, Lucas felt a profound sadness mixed with a renewed sense of hope. This dog was a connection to his father, a living memory, but it was clear Blade was not the same gentle companion it once was. Its body language screamed keep away, its intelligent eyes wary, wild, haunted. It watched him for another long moment, then, with a silent, fluid motion, turned and vanished into the deepening shadows, leaving Lucas alone once more with the lingering scent of ash and the growing certainty that his father's death was no accident. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of grief and dust. Lucas took up residence in the old corrugated metal warehouse, the only structure on the property that had been spared by the flames. It was a cavernous, hollow space, smelling of rust and dry soil. A single bare bulb hanging from a long cord provided a weak, yellow light that did little to ward off the oppressive shadows. He slept on a pile of old grain sacks, using his rucksack as a pillow, the familiar weight of his Army-issue survival knife pressed against his hip, a small, cold comfort in the profound emptiness. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making each breath feel heavy. His solitude was broken on the third day by the arrival of a pristine black sedan that looked ridiculously out of place against the backdrop of ruin. A man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel with an air of distaste. This was Mr. Davies, the insurance investigator. He was a man in his 40s, with a meticulously styled haircut and a thin, unsmiling mouth. He carried a leather-bound portfolio and exuded an aura of detached, clinical suspicion. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any genuine sympathy. "I am Arthur Davies, Senior Claims Adjuster. My condolences for your loss." The words were a formality, delivered with the same emotional investment one might use to read a grocery list. Lucas remained standing by the warehouse entrance, his arms crossed. "What do you want, Mr. Davies?" Davies opened his portfolio. "Just a few routine questions. Our records indicate your father, Robert Grayson, had a substantial life insurance policy, naming you as the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, the farm itself was insured for a considerable sum." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Business been slow lately, Mr. Grayson?" "Farming is a tough trade. We understand your father was having some financial difficulties in the last few years before his death in August 2018. The implication was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. My father was a proud man. He would never—" "Of course," Davies interrupted smoothly, "but fires are a convenient way to solve difficult financial problems, especially for someone with your particular set of skills. A man with a military background knows a thing or two about starting them, wouldn't you say?" Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Lucas. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Are you accusing me of something?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than professional detachment appeared in Davies's eyes. A smug satisfaction. "I'm merely exploring all possibilities, Mr. Grayson. It's my job. We will be conducting a thorough investigation. Don't leave the county." With a curt nod, he turned, got back into his air-conditioned car, and drove away, leaving a plume of dust and a cloud of poison in his wake. The investigator's visit was the turning point. When Lucas drove into the small town of Murphy for supplies, he felt the change. The friendly nods he used to receive were replaced by averted gazes. Whispers followed him down the aisle of the general store. The woman at the checkout counter, who had known him since he was a boy, suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, her movements brisk and dismissive. The poison had spread. He was no longer just the grieving son of a local farmer. He was a suspect, a pariah. The isolation was now complete, a wall built of rumor and suspicion. He returned to the hollow shell of the farm, the silence more profound than ever. But he was not entirely alone. Every morning he would see Blade, watching from the edge of the juniper trees. The dog was a phantom, a gray and white ghost haunting the periphery of his world. Lucas knew he couldn't force a reunion. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt piece by piece. He started simply. Each morning and evening, he would fill a dented metal bowl with fresh water and another with the dry dog food he'd bought in town. He would place them near the edge of the burned-out foundation, a neutral ground between his warehouse and Blade's wilderness, and then retreat. Hours later, when he checked, the food and water would be gone. After a few days of this silent ritual, he began to talk to the dog. He would sit on an overturned bucket a good 50 yards from the bowls, his voice low and steady, a gentle murmur against the ever-present wind. He didn't call the dog or command it, he just spoke. He talked about his father, about the long days they spent fixing fences, about the smell of the earth after a rainstorm. He spoke of his time overseas, the dust and the noise, and how the memory of these quiet fields had kept him sane. Blade would listen, his head cocked, his intelligent eyes fixed on Lucas. He never came closer, but he stopped vanishing immediately. He would stay, a silent, watchful presence for as long as Lucas spoke. The breakthrough came a week after Lucas's return. The weight of it all, the grief, the suspicion, the crushing loneliness, became too much. Lucas sat by the foundation, his head in his hands, a dry sob catching in his throat. He didn't make a sound, but his shoulders shook with the force of his despair. He felt, more than saw, a change in the space around him. He slowly lifted his head. Blade was there. Not 30 yards away, but a mere 10. He was standing, his body still tense, but the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a hesitant empathy. He let out a soft whine, a sound that was not a growl of warning but a question. Lucas stayed perfectly still, his heart pounding. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. It's okay." Blade took another tentative step, then another. The distance closed with an agonizing slowness, each footfall a monumental act of trust. Finally, the dog was standing just before him, close enough for Lucas to smell the scent of wild sage and dust on his coat. Lucas slowly extended a hand, palm up, and waited. Blade watched the hand for a long moment, then leaned forward and gently nudged it with his wet nose. The simple touch was an absolution. A wave of relief so powerful it left Lucas lightheaded washed over him. He gently stroked the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur. Blade leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating in his chest. The silence had been broken. From that day on, Blade was his shadow. He still wouldn't enter the warehouse, preferring the open air, but he was always there, a steady, reassuring presence at Lucas's side. The wall of isolation had been breached by a bond that needed no words. On the third evening after their reunion, Lucas noticed a change in Blade's behavior. The dog grew restless, pacing back and forth near the warehouse entrance. He would whine, nudge Lucas with his nose, and then trot a few paces away, looking back expectantly. "What is it, boy?" "What's wrong?" Lucas asked. Blade barked, a single, sharp sound full of purpose. He then led Lucas away from the ruins of the main house, past the charred barn, and to a forgotten corner of the property, right beside the very warehouse Lucas was living in. Here, half overgrown with weeds, was a flat, wide slab of concrete, the foundation of an old dairy shed that had been torn down decades ago. Lucas had walked over it 100 times without a second thought. But Blade stopped directly in the center of it, his entire body quivering with a strange intensity. He lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing frantically at one particular spot. Then, he began to dig. His powerful front paws scraped uselessly against the hard, unforgiving surface of the concrete, the sound loud in the quiet twilight. He whined with frustration, looked up at Lucas with an expression of desperate urgency, and then went back to scratching at the solid slab, his claws clicking against the stone. He was not just digging randomly. He was trying to show Lucas something hidden, something buried deep beneath the concrete. Blade's frantic digging against the unyielding concrete resonated in the quiet twilight, a desperate plea for understanding. Lucas watched the dog, his mind racing. This wasn't just playful scratching. This was an animal with a mission, driven by something deep and urgent. The dog's eyes, usually wary, now burned with an intensity that brooked no argument. "All right, boy," Lucas murmured, a tremor in his voice. "All right. I hear you." He knelt beside Blade, running his hand over the rough concrete. The slab was old, cracked in places, but solid. Blade continued to scratch at a specific spot, a faint discoloration on the gray surface. Lucas examined it closely, his ranger training kicking in, observing, analyzing, searching for the anomalous. There, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, was a faint seam, perfectly straight, running across the concrete. It wasn't a natural crack. It was a cut, a deliberate, precise cut. Lucas knew concrete. To make a cut like that, one needed specialized equipment, a wet saw with a diamond blade. His father, Robert Grayson, had been a jack of all trades, a man who could fix anything and build anything. He had owned such a saw, used for various farm projects over the years. This wasn't a random spot. His father had made this cut. Returning to the warehouse, Lucas rummaged through the sparse tools that had been spared by the fire. He found an old crowbar and a heavy-duty sledgehammer. Blade watched him, his tail wagging tentatively, a spark of anticipation in his golden brown eyes. Back at the concrete slab, Lucas positioned the tip of the crowbar into the faint seam. He struck the end of the crowbar with the sledgehammer, sending a jarring vibration through the ground. The concrete groaned, a low, grinding sound. He repeated the action again and again, the rhythmic thud echoing in the stillness of the night. It was slow, back-breaking work, fueled by a grim determination. After what felt like hours, a section of the concrete, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, finally gave way with a sharp crack. It lifted slightly. With a grunt, Lucas leveraged the crowbar, prying the heavy slab upwards and pushing it to the side. Blade let out a triumphant bark, peering into the dark opening. Beneath the slab, nestled in a small, meticulously dug cavity, was a fireproof safe. It was a compact, heavy-duty model, designed to withstand extreme temperatures and impact. This wasn't some flimsy metal box. This was a serious piece of equipment, chosen by a man who knew he might need to protect something vital. It was exactly the kind of careful, foresightful planning Lucas would expect from his father. "Good boy, Blade," Lucas said, reaching down to pat the dog's head. Blade nudged his hand affectionately, then sat patiently as Lucas worked. The safe was locked, of course. Lucas examined it. His father had been old school, preferring mechanical locks to electronic ones, which could fail or be hacked. He knelt, pulling a small, worn leather pouch from his pocket, a collection of lock-picking tools he'd carried since his ranger days, a skill often useful in unexpected ways. He ran his fingers over the tumblers, listening intently to the faint clicks as he manipulated the pins. It was a familiar, meditative process, a focus that momentarily pushed aside his grief. After a few tense minutes, there was a final, satisfying click, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 items: a thick, leather-bound journal and a sleek, silver USB drive. Lucas carefully retrieved them. The journal felt heavy and solid in his hands, its pages yellowed with age, filled with his father's distinctive, careful handwriting. He sat down on the ground, Blade settling beside him, his head resting on Lucas's knee. The light was fading fast, but there was just enough ambient glow to read. Lucas opened the journal to the first entry. It began simply, dated January 2017. "The land is changing. I feel it in my bones. And it's not just the weather." Robert Grayson's entries detailed his growing concerns. He wrote about the strange blight affecting his crops, a disease that seemed to only strike those who hadn't switched to the new improved fertilizers offered by Viridian Agrotech. He documented the visits from aggressive representatives of the company, pressuring him to sell his land, hinting at impending doom for those who resisted. Robert's handwriting grew more urgent in the later entries. He wrote about Vincent Rourke, the ruthless CEO of Viridian Agrotech. Rourke was a name that had begun to appear in local news a few years prior, a shrewd businessman who had aggressively expanded his company's reach into Owyhee County, buying up struggling farms, consolidating land, and introducing innovative new agricultural products. Robert described Rourke as a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a man who spoke of progress while leaving a trail of broken promises and disillusioned farmers. The journal revealed Robert's meticulous, almost scientific approach to his suspicions. He had taken samples of soil and water, had meticulously recorded the yields of his crops versus those of his neighbors using Viridian products. He spoke of a particular chemical, Solace, Viridian's flagship product, that seemed to be at the heart of the problem. Robert believed Solace was not just a fertilizer, but something far more insidious. He sensed a larger, darker game at play, a corporate land grab disguised as agricultural innovation. The last entry, dated just a few days before the fire in August 2018, was stark and chilling. They know I'm onto them. Rourke himself paid me a visit. He made threats. Not direct, but clear enough. He wants this land. He wants all of it. If anything happens to me, Lucas, know this. It was not an accident. Look for the truth. It's hidden where you least expect it. Trust Blade. He knows. Lucas closed the journal, his hands trembling. His father had known. He had fought, and he had been murdered. The grief, now laced with a burning anger, solidified into a resolve colder and harder than the concrete slab they had just unearthed. The sheriff's accident was a lie. The next morning, Lucas drove into town. He stopped at a modest office on Main Street, its sign faded but respectable. Benjamin Carter, attorney at law. Benjamin Carter was a man in his early 60s, with a kind, weary face framed by thinning gray hair and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He had been the Grayson family's lawyer for decades, handling everything from land deeds to occasional livestock disputes. He greeted Lucas with a somber handshake, his eyes reflecting genuine sorrow. "Lucas, my boy, I am so sorry about Robert. He was a good friend." Lucas cut to the chase. He placed the journal and the USB drive on Carter's cluttered desk. "My father was murdered, Mr. Carter. This is what I found." Carter picked up the journal, his brow furrowed as he read the last entries. His face paled. "Robert. He told me he was looking into something big, but he wouldn't give me details, said it was too dangerous. He only mentioned Viridian Agrotech, said they were sharks." He looked at Lucas, his expression grave. "He did warn me to expect trouble. He made me promise, if anything ever happened, to assist you in any way I could." "Did he leave anything with you?" Lucas asked. Carter nodded slowly. "He did. A sealed envelope. He insisted that I hold on to it and only give it to you if something happened to him. Said it contained critical information about his investigation. He was a thorough man, Robert, always thinking ahead." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax. "I suspect it might contain more details about what's on that USB drive." He pushed the envelope across the desk. "Lucas, you need to understand. Vincent Rourke and Viridian Agrotech, they're powerful. They have deep pockets. They own politicians. They own judges. They might even own people in law enforcement. Taking them on is like going up against a storm. Your father was a brave man. Be careful." Lucas picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of his father's legacy and his warning. "I will be, Mr. Carter. But I'm not going to stop. Not until I find out the truth." He glanced at Blade, who was patiently waiting by the door, his eyes fixed on Lucas. Blade knew. His father had trusted the dog, and now so would Lucas. The drive back from Benjamin Carter's office was a silent, somber affair. Lucas sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, the sealed envelope from the lawyer on the passenger seat beside the journal and the USB drive. It was a small pile of objects that represented the entirety of his father's final, desperate fight. The weight of it all settled on him, a burden of truth and a mandate for justice. Blade sat beside the pile, his head up, eyes forward, a silent, steady presence in the swirling chaos of Lucas's thoughts. In the days that followed, the warehouse ceased to be a mere shelter and became a makeshift command center. The profound loneliness that had threatened to consume Lucas was held at bay by the quiet companionship of the dog. They fell into a rhythm, a routine forged in their shared solitude. They were a team now, their bond solidifying with each passing hour. No longer just a man and a dog, but partners in a silent mission. Every interaction with Blade was a bittersweet echo of the past, a way for Lucas to reconnect with the father he had lost. When he shared his meager meals, canned stew or jerky, he would watch Blade eat with a patient, dignified focus, and he would remember his father doing the same, tossing scraps to a younger Blade with a low chuckle, saying, "A good dog earns his keep, and you, my friend, are the best." Lucas found himself talking to Blade constantly, not because he expected an answer, but because the dog was a vessel for his memories. As he groomed Blade's thick gray and white coat, picking out burrs from their walks, he would feel the familiar texture of the fur under his hands and recall Robert teaching him how to do it properly. "Always brush with the grain, son. Show him respect, and he'll give you his loyalty." Each gentle stroke was a conversation with a ghost, a way of feeling his father's presence in the here and now. Blade, in turn, seemed to understand. He would lean into Lucas's touch, a low rumble of contentment in his chest, his golden brown eyes full of an ancient, knowing sadness. He was no longer the feral, fearful creature from the woods. He was a guardian, a confidant, a living link to a life that had been stolen. One afternoon, Lucas sat on the warehouse floor, the journal open in his lap. He was trying to decipher some of his father's more cryptic notes about land parcels and chemical compositions. But the technical jargon was dense, and his frustration was mounting. He felt stuck, adrift in a sea of data without a map. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. Blade, who had been dozing near the open door, lifted his head, his ears perked. He seemed to sense the shift in Lucas's demeanor. He rose, stretched his powerful frame, and walked over, nudging Lucas's hand with his cold, wet nose. "I don't know where to look next, boy," Lucas said, his voice low. "He says the proof is in the land, but all I see is ash." Blade whined softly, then nudged him again, this time more insistently. When Lucas didn't move, the dog turned and trotted to the doorway, looking back over his shoulder, his tail giving a single, expectant wag. It was the same look he'd had before leading him to the concrete slab. He had somewhere else to go. "You have another idea?" Lucas asked, a flicker of hope stirring within him. Blade let out a short, sharp bark of confirmation. Trusting the dog's intuition, which had proven more reliable than any human investigation so far, Lucas closed the journal, grabbed a flashlight and his rucksack, and followed. Blade didn't lead him toward the road or the neighboring farms. Instead, he headed for the dense woods that bordered the back of the Grayson property, plunging into the trees along a narrow, overgrown path that was little more than a deer trail. This was not a public route. This was a path worn by familiar feet, a secret way known only to someone who had walked this land for a lifetime. Lucas pushed through low-hanging pine branches, the air growing cooler and smelling of damp earth and pine needles. It was a relief to be away from the scent of ash, to be in a place that still felt alive. He remembered this trail from his childhood, a place he and his father would walk, his father pointing out different types of trees and animal tracks. It was a path to his father's sanctuary. After a 20-minute walk, they emerged into a small, secluded clearing. Nestled in the center was a small hunting cabin, a familiar sight from Lucas's youth. It was a simple, sturdy structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a single stone chimney and a small, weathered porch. It was the place Robert Grayson had always come to think, to escape the pressures of the farm, to be alone with his thoughts. It was a place of profound peace and solitude. The door was unlocked. Lucas pushed it open, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of old wood, canvas, and the faint, lingering scent of his father's pipe tobacco. It was Spartan, furnished with only a simple cot, a small wood-burning stove, and a single wooden table and chair. A worn flannel shirt, one of his father's favorites, was still hanging from a peg on the wall. It felt as though his father had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. This place, untouched by the fire, was a perfect time capsule of the man Robert Grayson had been. Lucas began to search, his movements methodical. He checked under the cot, inside the cold stove, behind the loose stones of the hearth. He found nothing but dust and mouse droppings. He sat down at the table, a feeling of disappointment settling in. Perhaps he had been wrong to follow. Perhaps this was just a place Blade remembered fondly. But Blade was not idle. He hadn't been sniffing randomly. He bypassed all the obvious hiding spots and went directly to a corner of the small cabin near the base of the stone chimney. He began sniffing intently at the wooden floorboards, his nose twitching. He whined, a low, urgent sound, and began scratching at one specific plank, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. He looked up at Lucas, his eyes pleading, before resuming his frantic scratching. It was the same look, the same desperate intensity as before. "You found something again, didn't you, boy?" Lucas whispered. He knelt down, examining the floorboard. It looked identical to the others, old and worn. But when he pressed on it, there was a faint give, a slight movement the others didn't have. Using the tip of his survival knife, he carefully worked it into the seam and pried. The board came up with a soft groan of old wood. Beneath it was a small hidden compartment. And inside that compartment was a heavy, lead-lined box. Lucas's breath caught. A lead-lined box was used to block scents and signals, the kind of thing a careful man would use to hide something he never wanted to be found by accident. He lifted the box out. It was heavy, sealed with a simple clasp. He opened it. Inside, nestled in protective cotton batting, were a dozen small glass jars. Each jar was filled with either dark, sickly-looking soil or cloudy, murky water. And on each jar was a small, neatly handwritten label. Lucas picked one up. Sample 4B, Miller's Creek downstream from Viridian Runoff, June 2018. He picked up another. Sample 7A, Soil from Donovan's North Pasture after Solace Treatment, July 2018. This was it. This was the physical proof. His father hadn't just suspected. He had been building a scientific case. He had been collecting evidence of the poison that was seeping into their land, into their water. He had hidden it here, in his most private sanctuary, protected by a loyal guardian who would only reveal it to the right person. Lucas looked at Blade, who sat watching him, panting softly. "He trusted you," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "He trusted you to show me. You're more than just a dog, aren't you? You're his legacy." The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet main street of Murphy as Lucas pushed open the door to Benjamin Carter's law office. Blade was at his heels, moving with a quiet confidence that was a world away from the fearful, feral creature he had been just weeks ago. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of their purpose, his golden brown eyes watchful and alert. Lucas placed the lead-lined box on Carter's desk with a heavy thud. The lawyer, who had been poring over a dusty legal tome, looked up over his spectacles, his expression shifting from scholarly curiosity to sharp focus, as Lucas opened the lid to reveal the carefully labeled jars of soil and water. "My father's fieldwork," Lucas said, his voice flat and hard. "This is the proof from the land." Now we need to see the proof from the inside. He placed the silver USB drive on the desk beside the journal. Carter picked up the drive, examining it. Robert was always a step ahead. He knew a paper trail could be burned, but a digital one, that's harder to erase completely. He plugged the drive into his computer. A moment later, his brow furrowed in frustration. A single window popped up on his screen, demanding a complex alphanumeric password. It's encrypted, military grade by the looks of it. Robert didn't leave any notes? A password hint? Lucas shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. My father was a ranger in Vietnam before he was a farmer. He taught me that if you want to keep something safe, you make it so only one other person can open it. Someone who thinks like you do. He sat down at the computer. The password prompt had a question. Where the river remembers the sky. It wasn't a question for a stranger. It was a message for his son. Lucas closed his eyes, picturing the farm, the rolling hills, the endless Idaho sky. He remembered a place, a high ridge on the property where the river below was so still and clear it perfectly mirrored the clouds above. It was his mother's favorite spot. His father had called it Heaven's Mirror. He typed the words into the password field. Heaven's Mirror 2003. The year his mother had passed away. A second of tense silence. Then the encryption barrier vanished, revealing a meticulously organized set of folders. How did you know? Carter breathed, his eyes wide with astonishment. He knew I would remember, Lucas replied softly. For the next several hours, the only sounds in the small, dusty office were the quiet clicking of the mouse, the rustle of paper, and Blade's soft, rhythmic breathing as he lay on the floor. What they uncovered was a conspiracy far more insidious and cold-blooded than Lucas had ever imagined. The first folder contained encrypted emails, a chain of correspondence between Vincent Rourke and his top executives. The language was sterile, corporate, but the meaning was chillingly clear when cross-referenced with Robert's journal. They never used words like poison or sabotage. Instead, they talked of aggressive nutrient depletion cycles and market-driven land consolidation. One email from Rourke stood out. The Grayson property remains the final holdout. His resistance is impacting the timeline for Phase 2. Expedite the acquisition protocol. I don't want any more delays. It was a death sentence, written in the language of a business memo. The second folder was labeled Financials, and it contained a web of suspicious money transfers. They found ledgers detailing large, anonymous payments funneled through shell corporations. These payments went to a handful of individuals in Owyhee County, including a recurring payment to an account that, after some clever digging by Carter through public records, was linked to a close relative of Sheriff Morgan. So that's why he was so eager to close the case, Carter said, his voice laced with disgust. He wasn't just incompetent, he was compromised, bought and paid for. But the most damning evidence was in the final folder, titled simply Project Solace. Inside was a single password-protected file. This password was different, a string of scientific variables. Lucas found it scrawled on a small piece of paper tucked into the back of his father's journal. It was the key to the truth. The file opened to reveal the complete, unredacted laboratory report on the chemical known as Solace. It was a 200-page scientific document filled with charts, graphs, and chemical analyses. The public-facing marketing material Lucas had seen described Solace as a revolutionary fertilizer that boosted crop yields by 300%. This report told the real story. Solace was a masterpiece of malevolent chemistry. It worked by triggering a plant's growth hormones into overdrive, forcing a massive, unsustainable burst of life. But to fuel this growth, it simultaneously attacked and destroyed the vital microorganisms in the soil, the bacteria and fungi responsible for creating nutrients and maintaining the land's long-term health. The report concluded that after 3 to 5 years of solace application, the soil would be rendered completely sterile, unable to support any life without massive and constant chemical intervention. Chemicals that only Viridian Agrotech sold. Lucas felt a cold sickness spread through his gut. This wasn't just a business. It was a protection racket on a massive scale. Rourke wasn't just selling a product, he was selling an addiction. He was a dealer, and his drug was a chemical that murdered the land itself. The full picture slammed into Lucas and Carter with the force of a physical blow. They finally understood Rourke's monstrous plan. It was a slow, patient, and methodical conquest. He would identify a target region, introduce solace through aggressive marketing, and wait. As the farms began to fail, as the land died beneath the farmers' feet, Viridian Agrotech would sweep in, offering to buy the now worthless properties for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just building a company. He was building an empire on the ashes of family farms. And Lucas's father, Robert Grayson, had figured it all out. He had the journal documenting the timeline. He had the physical samples from the poisoned land. And he had this USB drive with the internal communications and the scientific proof. He wasn't just a resistant landowner. He was the one man who could bring Rourke's entire empire crashing down. His death wasn't just a possibility. It was an inevitability. He hadn't been killed because he was in the way. He had been executed because he knew the truth. Lucas leaned back in his chair, the screen's glow reflecting in his hard hazel eyes. The grief was still there, a deep, aching void. But now it was accompanied by something else, something cold and pure and terrifyingly focused. It was rage. A controlled rage, honed by years of discipline and combat, but rage nonetheless. This was no longer just about avenging his father. This was about stopping a war that Rourke had declared on his home, on his community, on the very earth beneath their feet. He looked down at Blade. The dog had lifted his head and was looking up at him, his gaze steady and unwavering. He seemed to sense the change, the shift from grief to resolve. Lucas reached down and placed a hand on the dog's head. "He started this fight, boy," Lucas whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We're going to finish it." The weight of the truth was a physical burden. With the evidence laid bare, Lucas Grayson understood the full scope of Vincent Rourke's war, but he also understood his own isolation. Benjamin Carter was a good man and a capable lawyer, but he was a man of books and statutes. The fight ahead required a different set of skills, and Lucas knew he couldn't wage this war alone. The first calls he made were to the ghosts of his past, men from his ranger unit who had settled back into civilian life. The process was a harsh lesson in the realities of the world outside the military. The first man, a demolitions expert now running a construction business in Arizona, listened patiently before giving his regrets. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I really am. But I've got a wife and 2 kids now. I can't bring that kind of trouble to their doorstep." The second, a communications specialist in Oregon, was more blunt. "A corporation? You want to go up against a billionaire and his army of lawyers? You're on your own, man. That's suicide." He even tried speaking to a few of the neighboring ranchers, men his father had known for decades. He showed them the soil analysis, explained what Viridian was doing to their land. He saw flickers of recognition, of dawning horror in their eyes. But it was always extinguished by fear. Rourke's influence was a suffocating blanket over the entire county. They would offer quiet condolences, a sad shake of the head, and then retreat behind locked doors. Each refusal was a fresh wound, deepening his sense of isolation. He had the truth, but the truth was useless without the courage to wield it. Dejected, Lucas sat in his truck outside the Murphy General Store, Blade's head resting on his thigh, a warm, reassuring weight. There was one last call he could make. A man he'd served with through 2 brutal tours, a man who had pulled him out of a firefight in the Korengal Valley in 2013. He hadn't wanted to drag him into this, but he was out of options. He dialed the number. "Cross," a calm, deep voice answered on the second ring. "Ben, it's Lucas." There was a pause. "Lucas Grayson. Man, it's been years. I heard about your father. I'm sorry." "That's why I'm calling, Ben. It wasn't an accident." Lucas spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out, his voice low and steady, presenting the facts with the dispassionate clarity of a field report. He spoke of the fire, the journal, the encrypted files, the poison called Solace. Benjamin Cross, a former Army Ranger sergeant, was now the head of security for a tech firm in Boise. He was a big man, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a tranquil demeanor that concealed a mind that was always calculating angles. He was the rock, the immovable object to Lucas's irresistible force. He listened without interruption, his silence more telling than 1,000 questions. "You're asking for a lot, Lucas," Ben said finally, his voice heavy. "This isn't some warlord in a mud hut. This is a corporate giant on home soil. They play dirty." "I know," Lucas said, "but he murdered my father. I can't let that go." Another long silence stretched between them. Lucas could hear the faint hum of office life on Ben's end, a world away from the dust and ash of the Grayson farm. "I'll be there tomorrow," Ben said, and the line went dead. True to his word, Ben arrived the next day. Seeing his old friend, solid and dependable, was the first real hope Lucas had felt in weeks. They spent the evening going over the evidence. Ben's expertise was in risk assessment and operations. He saw the enemy clearly, but also saw their own weaknesses. "We have the what and the why," Ben concluded, pointing at the files on Lucas's laptop. "But we're missing the how. We need more intel on their current operations. And we need a way to get this story out that they can't kill with lawyers. We need someone who operates outside the system." He looked at Lucas. "I think I know someone. She's difficult, but she's the best there is." 2 days later, they were in a cramped third-floor apartment in a rundown part of Boise, the air thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of stale coffee. Madeline Brooks was a whirlwind of nervous energy. In her late 20s, she was small and wiry, with a shock of spiky, dyed black hair and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. She wore a faded band t-shirt and cargo pants, and a series of complex silver rings adorned her fingers as they flew across a keyboard. Her apartment was a digital nest, with 3 monitors displaying scrolling lines of code, a server rack humming in the corner, and a web of cables snaking across the floor. She had been a rising star in investigative journalism until an exposé she wrote on Viridian Agrotech's labor practices in 2016 was systematically dismantled and buried, costing her the job and her reputation. Now, she was a freelance hacker and digital journalist, a ghost in the machine who waged war from the shadows. She looked at Lucas and Ben with profound cynicism. "Let me guess," she said without looking up from her screen. "You're the good soldiers here to save the world, right?" "I've heard that one before." "We're not here to save the world," Lucas said, his voice even. "We're here for justice. You wrote about Viridian before. You know what they're capable of." "Knowing and proving are 2 different things," she shot back, finally turning to face them, her gaze sharp and appraising. "And proving it without getting crushed is a third. What do you have that's better than what I had?" Lucas didn't argue. He simply placed the USB drive on the desk beside her keyboard. "My father's legacy. See for yourself." Madeline eyed the drive with suspicion, then plugged it into her system. Her initial skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by a focused intensity. Her fingers danced across the keys, bypassing the simple password Lucas had used, peeling back layers of hidden code. "Your father was good," she muttered, a hint of professional respect in her voice. "He hid partitioned data within the file architecture itself." For an hour, she worked in silence, her eyes wide as she navigated the labyrinth of corruption. She saw the real Solace report, the financial trails, the cold-blooded emails. She saw the truth. "This is it," she whispered, leaning back, her face pale. "This is everything. They didn't just ruin my career. They're killing people." She looked at Lucas, the cynicism in her eyes replaced by a burning, righteous anger that mirrored his own. "Okay, soldier. You've got my attention. What's the plan?" With Madeline on board, the team had its brain. She immediately began digging, her digital tendrils spreading into Viridian's network. "We need a human face for this," she said after a day of furious research. "The data is damning, but people connect with people. I've found him. A rancher, third generation. Viridian is about to foreclose on his land. He's been using Solace for 4 years. His name is Michael Donovan." They found Michael Donovan on his failing ranch, a mirror image of what the Grayson farm could have become. He was a man in his 50s, his shoulders slumped with the weight of defeat, his face a roadmap of sun-beaten worry. He was distrustful at first, hearing the rumors that Lucas was a fraud. But Lucas didn't approach him as a soldier. He spoke to him as a farmer's son. He walked the dying fields with Donovan, took a handful of the dry, lifeless soil. He showed him his father's journal, the soil samples, the lab report. He showed Donovan that this failure was not his fault, that he had been systematically poisoned and deceived. Tears welled in the older man's eyes as he looked at the proof. The shame he had carried for years was replaced by a slow-burning anger. "That son of a..." he choked out. "He came to my door, promising a miracle." He looked at Lucas, his expression hardening with resolve. "What do you need me to do?" That evening, the 4 of them gathered in the dusty warehouse. Lucas, the soldier and leader, Ben, the strategist and rock, Madeline, the digital ghost and truth-teller, and Michael, the heart of the community and the voice of the victims. A small, improbable team united by grief and anger, ready to fight back. The silence no longer felt like isolation. It felt like the calm before a storm. The warehouse, once a symbol of Lucas's isolation, now buzzed with a focused energy. Maps of Owyhee County, satellite images, and floor plans of Viridian agrotech facilities were spread across makeshift tables. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the quiet intensity of minds at work. Lucas, Benjamin Cross, Madeline Brooks, and Michael Donovan, united by a common enemy, were meticulously planning their first offensive. Their target, Viridian Agrotech's main distribution center, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Caldwell, about an hour's drive from the Grayson farm. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by fences, cameras, and private security. Their objective was twofold: obtain an unadulterated, unmixed sample of Solace directly from its source. A sample that couldn't be dismissed as tampered, and if possible, plant surveillance devices to gather more intel on Viridian's internal operations. "This isn't a smash and grab," Lucas stressed, tracing a finger across a satellite image of the complex. "This is precision. We go in, we get what we need, and we get out before anyone knows we were there." His ranger training echoed in every word. Benjamin Cross, ever the strategist, outlined the security protocols. They've got a minimum of 5 guards on night patrol, rotating every 90 minutes. Thermal imaging on the perimeter. Keycard access for all interior doors. The good news is, their network security is surprisingly lax for a company of their size. They rely on physical deterrence. He glanced at Madeline. "That's where you come in, Maddie." Madeline Brooks, perched on an upturned crate, her fingers flying across her laptop, smirked. "Physical deterrence is only as good as the eyes watching it. I can get into their camera feeds, give us a window, but I can't keep them down forever. We're talking minutes, maybe seconds of truly dark time. Her spiky black hair seemed to vibrate with her nervous energy, but her eyes were sharp, already dissecting the digital vulnerabilities. Michael Donovan, though not directly involved in the infiltration, played a crucial role in the planning. His intimate knowledge of local roads, back trails, and the habits of rural security teams provided invaluable intelligence that no satellite image could offer. "There's an old service road, mostly washed out, behind the west fence," he pointed out. "Goes right up against the county line. Not many people know about it." Lucas looked at Blade, who was lying quietly at his feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of their voices. "And you, boy," Lucas murmured. "You're our eyes and ears on the ground. You'll smell things we can't see, hear things we can't hear." Blade thumped his tail softly against the dusty floor, his intelligent eyes fixed on Lucas. The night of the operation was clear and cold, the Idaho sky a canvas of 1,000,000,000 stars. Lucas, dressed in dark, non-reflective tactical gear, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Benjamin, equally camouflaged, moved with the quiet grace of a predator. Madeline was set up in a borrowed RV, miles away, her monitors glowing in the dark, ready to cut the digital strings. Michael remained at the farm, a nervous but steadfast anchor. They approached the Viridian Agrotech complex from the overgrown service road Michael had identified. The air grew heavy with a faint chemical tang, the signature scent of solace. Lucas moved like a ghost, his senses extended, acutely aware of every rustle of leaves, every distant chirp of a cricket. Benjamin moved in lockstep, a silent, powerful shadow. Blade, however, was their true guide. He moved ahead of them, a low-slung, gray and white shadow flitting through the underbrush. His nose was constantly to the ground, his ears swiveling, picking up scents and sounds far beyond human perception. He wasn't just following, he was leading, his instincts honed by years in the wild and an innate understanding of the terrain. Suddenly, Blade stopped dead, his body tensing, a low, almost imperceptible growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles rose slightly. He turned his head, pointing his nose towards a section of the fence 50 yards to their left. Lucas and Benjamin froze. "What is it, boy?" Lucas whispered. Blade remained still, his focus unwavering. Then, from the direction he indicated, they heard it, the faint, rhythmic crunch of gravel, growing steadily louder. A security guard performing his rounds earlier than expected, or perhaps taking an unscheduled detour. "Guard coming," Benjamin murmured, confirming Blade's silent warning. "Good boy, Blade. Very good boy." They melted deeper into the shadows, pressing themselves against the cold earth, waiting. The guard, a burly man with a flashlight, passed by their position oblivious, his beam sweeping through the empty air. If not for Blade, they would have walked straight into him. The dog had just saved their mission from premature failure. Once the guard had passed, Blade gave a soft huff, a signal that the coast was clear, and they continued their infiltration. Madeline's voice, a calm whisper, came through their comms. "Okay, guys, I'm in the perimeter cameras. You've got approximately 30 seconds of blind spot on the west fence. Go." Lucas and Benjamin moved like blurs, cutting through the chain-link fence with specialized tools. They were inside. The warehouse was massive, a maze of towering shelves and pallets. The air here was heavy with the cloying, sickly sweet scent of solace. Blade was invaluable inside. While Lucas and Benjamin systematically searched for the unmixed solace containers, the dog moved through the cavernous space, a silent sentinel. He would pause, sniff, and sometimes let out a soft whine, indicating a hidden camera or a pressure plate that Lucas hadn't seen. He even found a small, unmarked side door that led to a secondary storage area, an area not visible on any of the blueprints Madeline had. It was there, in a refrigerated section, that they found it. Tall, unlabeled drums, clearly marked raw chemical stock, do not mix. This was the pure solace. Working quickly, Lucas used a specialized syringe to extract a precise sample into a sterile vial. Benjamin, meanwhile, skillfully placed tiny, coin-sized listening devices and cameras in strategic locations, hardwired into the existing network, carefully masked to look like part of the building's infrastructure. "Time's up, boys! Guards on the move! Get out, now!" Madeline's urgent voice crackled in their ears. They made it out just as the next patrol rounded the corner, vanishing back into the darkness. They drove back to the farm in silence, the sterile vial clutched tightly in Lucas's hand. The mission was a success. Back at the warehouse, Madeline, her eyes still blazing with a hacker's high, already had a plan for the next step. "The sample is critical for official channels," she told Lucas and Benjamin, referring to the physical evidence they'd acquired. "But the world needs to know something is wrong now. I'm going to leak a fraction of the emails, just enough to cause a stir, a hint of the truth, to sow doubt and paranoia in Viridian's ranks." Hours later, as the first rays of dawn touched the Idaho sky, a small, anonymous post appeared on an obscure agriculture forum. It contained a screenshot of a cryptic email chain between Viridian executives and the cropped, blurred image of the Project Solace lab report. Just enough to be intriguing, but not enough to be easily debunked. It was a single stone cast into a placid pond, but Lucas knew, with a grim satisfaction, that the ripples would soon begin to spread. The first strike had been made. The ripples from Madeline's initial leak were subtle at first, barely a tremor in the vast, calm waters of the agricultural internet. A few skeptical comments on farming forums, a minor blip on Viridian Agrotech's radar. But Vincent Rourke was not a man who tolerated even the smallest imperfection in his meticulously crafted empire. The whispers reached his ears, and the digital ghost of a partial email was enough to ignite his fury. Vincent Rourke was a man who cultivated an image of polished corporate success, impeccably tailored suits, a smooth, reassuring voice, and a public persona of a visionary leader committed to sustainable agriculture. But beneath the veneer of charm lay a predator's cold, calculating mind. In his early 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, Rourke saw every challenge as a personal affront, every obstacle as something to be crushed. He ruled Viridian Agrotech with an iron fist, his decisions final, his ambition boundless. The slightest hint of dissent or exposure was met with swift, brutal retaliation. Seated in his opulent office high above Boise, Rourke slammed his fist on his polished mahogany desk. "Find them!" he snarled into his phone, his voice losing its usual calm. "Find whoever is behind this pathetic leak and shut them down, and I want to know how they got that information." His security team, a collection of ex-military and former law enforcement officers, scurried to obey. They traced the leak to an untraceable proxy server, a dead end. Whoever was behind it was good, too good for a simple farmer. Rourke knew who was capable of this kind of quiet, surgical precision. He had heard about Lucas Grayson's return, had even seen the reports from his men about the accident at the Grayson farm. He knew Lucas was a former Army Ranger. He put two and two together. "He's making trouble," Rourke muttered, his eyes narrowing. "That boy is just like his father." Unable to pinpoint Lucas directly, or to access the secure location where Madeline was operating, Rourke turned his attention to a more vulnerable target. He needed to send a message. He needed to crush the burgeoning hope that Lucas and his team were trying to ignite among the local farmers. He needed to make an example. He contacted Sheriff Morgan. Sheriff Morgan answered Rourke's call with a nervous tremor in his voice. The envelopes of cash he received monthly, the quiet arrangements Rourke's people had made for his nephew's legal troubles, it all bound him to the corporation in a web of silent corruption. He knew he was compromised, but the benefits had been too tempting, the threats too real. He had tried to simply close the Grayson fire case, hoping it would all blow over. But now, Rourke's voice was sharper, colder. "Sheriff," Rourke began, his tone deceptively mild. "It seems we have a problem. Someone is spreading malicious rumors about Viridian, trying to incite unrest in the farming community. I believe it involves that Donovan fellow, Michael Donovan. He's been quite vocal lately, hasn't he?" Morgan swallowed hard. "Donovan? He's just a bitter old man, Mr. Rourke. His farm's failing." "Precisely," Rourke purred. "A desperate man is a dangerous man. A man who might be desperate enough to commit unlawful acts. Perhaps you've noticed some discrepancies, some minor violations at his property. Unregistered livestock, an old warrant for a minor infraction that was never fully cleared up. Something to bring him in for questioning." Morgan understood. Rourke wasn't asking for proof. He was asking for an excuse. He was asking for a man to be silenced. "I'll see what I can find," Morgan mumbled, his stomach churning with unease. The next afternoon, a patrol car, not Sheriff Morgan's, but driven by a younger, ambitious deputy named Deputy Miller, pulled up to Michael Donovan's struggling farm. Michael was out mending a fence, his old German shepherd Rusty dozing at his feet. Lucas, Benjamin, and Madeline were back at the Grayson warehouse, monitoring their new surveillance feeds and planning their next move. Deputy Miller, a tall, stiff young man barely out of the academy, approached Michael with an air of official authority. "Mr. Michael Donovan? That's me," Michael replied, straightening up, a sense of dread already forming. "You're under arrest, sir," Miller stated, pulling out handcuffs, "on suspicion of illegal possession of unregistered firearms, outstanding warrants for disturbing the peace from 2017, and resisting a lawful investigation." "What? That's insane! I don't own unregistered firearms, and disturbing the peace was a misunderstanding with a noisy neighbor 3 years ago that was settled," Michael protested, his voice rising in outrage. Rusty, sensing his master's distress, began to growl, a low guttural sound in his chest. Deputy Miller ignored him. "Any resistance will be met with force, sir. Please place your hands behind your back." Michael was roughly cuffed and led away, his protests dying on his lips. As he was shoved into the back of the patrol car, he caught a glimpse of his dying fields, the parched earth that Viridian Agrotech had stolen from him. A desperate, hopeless anger flared within him. Word of Michael Donovan's arrest spread through Owyhee County like wildfire, amplified by Madeline's careful seeding of information. Farmers, already on edge from Lucas's quiet campaign, now had tangible proof of Viridian's heavy-handed tactics. They saw what happened to those who spoke out, those who questioned. The fear was palpable, but so was something else, a simmering, collective outrage. At the Grayson warehouse, Lucas watched the news report on Madeline's monitor, his face grim. "They're trying to send a message," he stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. Michael was supposed to be the example. "And it worked to a degree," Benjamin conceded, his own face grim. "Most people will shut up now, too scared to poke the bear." "But not all," Madeline countered, her fingers flying across her keyboard, monitoring the pulse of the digital world. "The fear is there, but so is the anger. It's a powder keg, Lucas. Donovan's arrest has shown them what Rourke will do. But it's also shown them they're not safe, even in silence. They need a reason to light that fuse." Lucas clenched his jaw. Michael, a good man, was now sitting in a jail cell on trumped-up charges. It was a direct blow, a strategic move by Rourke to decapitate their budding rebellion. But it was also a mistake. By hurting one of their own, Rourke hadn't just instilled fear, he had created a unifying outrage. He looked at Blade, who was watching him intently, sensing the tension in the air. The dog let out a low, sympathetic whine. "Then we give them that reason," Lucas said, his voice cold and resolute. "We get Michael out, and we show them exactly what Rourke is capable of. It's time to push back harder. The enemy had shown its fangs. Now it was time for them to show theirs." The air in the warehouse was thick with a volatile mixture of anger and strategic urgency. Michael Donovan, a good man and the face of their burgeoning resistance, was in a cage, and the immediate, instinctual response from men like Lucas and Benjamin Cross was to meet force with force. "A transport vehicle will move him from the county holding cell to the main jail for processing," Benjamin said, his voice a low, analytical rumble as he sketched a diagram on a dusty tabletop. "We could intercept here, on this isolated stretch of road. Quick, clean, and we have him out before they can even radio for backup." Lucas listened, his jaw tight, the soldier in him recognizing the cold logic of the plan. It was efficient. It was possible. And it was wrong. "No," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the tension. The single word carried an undeniable finality. "That's how Rourke would do it. That's how they operate, with intimidation and force. We can't win this war by becoming the enemy. We lose everything the moment we do that. We lose the community. We lose the moral high ground. We lose." He turned to Madeline, who had been listening silently, her eyes glowing in the light of her multiple monitors. "There's another way," Lucas stated, his gaze locked on hers. "A better way. You said it yourself, they're sloppy. They rely on physical deterrence because their digital house is made of straw. Can you prove Michael is innocent?" A slow, dangerous smile spread across Madeline's face. The challenge lit a fire in her eyes. "Can I prove it?" she repeated, cracking her knuckles. "Soldier, I can make the system that arrested him spit out a formal apology." The plan shifted from a physical assault to a digital one. The target was no longer a transport vehicle, but the fragile web of data that held the town's official version of the truth. Madeline became the field commander, with Lucas and Benjamin acting as her support, running errands for hardware and keeping watch. Blade, sensing the shift in mood from physical tension to focused mental energy, lay quietly at Lucas's feet, a silent, furry anchor in the storm of information. Madeline's first objective was the alibi. The charge was disturbing the peace in 2017. It was flimsy, but official. "I need a digital footprint," she explained, her fingers a blur across the keyboard. "Credit card records, cell tower pings, anything to place him somewhere else on that specific date." She dove into the digital ether. It was a masterclass in controlled chaos. She peeled back layers of security on municipal servers, her movements swift and traceless. She found what she was looking for in the county's tax archives, a property tax payment Michael had made in person on the day in question. But the receipt was logged in the neighboring town of Silver Creek, 20 miles away. "Okay, he was in another town," she said, her focus absolute. "That's good. But not good enough. They'll say the timestamp is a clerical error. I need video." This was the real challenge. Hacking into a government server was one thing. Infiltrating the archaic, poorly maintained security system of a small-town feed store from 3 years ago was another. The system was a digital relic, full of security holes, but also unpredictable and unstable. For 2 hours, she battled the obsolete software, writing code on the fly to bypass corrupted data and failing firewalls. Lucas and Benjamin watched, mesmerized by the silent, intense battle unfolding on the screen. Then, she was in. "Got it," she breathed. She scoured the grainy, time-stamped footage, and there, at 2:14 p.m. on the date of the alleged disturbance, was a clear shot of Michael Donovan at the counter, smiling as he paid for a bag of feed. It was irrefutable. It was the truth, captured in black and white. "Now for the sheriff," Madeline said, her voice turning hard. "Time to see how he built this lie." Her next target was the Owyhee County Sheriff's Department's internal server. This was far more dangerous territory. She moved with extreme caution, a digital ghost slipping through encrypted portals. She found the official arrest report filed by Deputy Miller. It was clean, professional, and entirely fabricated, citing a non-existent anonymous tip about unregistered firearms. But Madeline knew that digital documents, like real ones, have drafts. She dug deeper into the server's metadata and communication logs. And then she found it. An internal email from Sheriff Morgan's account to Deputy Miller, sent the morning before the arrest. The subject line was simply, "Donovan." The message was short and chilling. "We need to bring in Michael Donovan for questioning. Find a reason. Anything that will stick. This comes from the top. VR." "VR," Lucas whispered, clenching his fists. "Vincent Rourke." "Bingo," Madeline said, a triumphant, savage grin on her face. He didn't just falsify a report. He documented the conspiracy. She quickly and securely downloaded the email, the alibi video, and the tax receipt into a single encrypted file. The digital bomb was built. They didn't leak it to the public. They delivered the file to the one man who could deploy it with surgical precision, Benjamin Carter. The next morning, the lawyer, armed with a tablet containing the evidence, walked into the Owyhee County Courthouse. He bypassed the usual channels and went straight to the district attorney, with Sheriff Morgan also present. What happened next became the stuff of local legend. Faced with an unassailable alibi for one charge and documented proof of conspiracy and falsification of official reports on the other, the DA's case crumbled in less than 10 minutes. Sheriff Morgan's face, according to a clerk who witnessed the exchange, went from flushed anger to a pasty, sickly white. An hour later, Michael Donovan walked out of the county holding cell, not in cuffs, but as a free, exonerated man. Madeline's anonymous tip to a Boise news station had paid off. A small crowd of reporters and a larger, more significant crowd of local farmers were waiting. Michael blinked in the bright sunlight, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. He didn't say much, his voice thick with emotion. "They said I did something I didn't do," he told the cameras, his voice shaking but clear. "And some good people proved they were lying. That's all I have to say." But it was enough. The story exploded. It wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. It was about a beloved local rancher being framed by a corrupt sheriff at the behest of a powerful corporation. The narrative had shifted. The fear that had kept the community silent for so long finally broke, replaced by a wave of collective, righteous anger. That evening, a procession of headlights cut through the darkness, pulling up the long, dusty driveway to the Grayson farm. One by one, farmers and ranchers got out of their trucks. These were the same men who had averted their eyes, who had been too scared to speak to Lucas just a week ago. They walked towards the warehouse, their faces grim, their shoulders squared. One of them, an old man who had been friends with Robert Grayson for 50 years, stepped forward. "We were scared, Lucas," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But we're not scared anymore. You showed us the truth. Now you tell us how we fight back." Lucas looked at the faces of his community, their eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. He was no longer an outcast. He was their leader. He looked down at Blade, who stood faithfully by his side. The war had just begun, but for the first time, he was no longer fighting it alone. The morning after Michael Donovan's exoneration, the Grayson farm, once a desolate monument to loss, became a vibrant hub of defiance. Trucks and pickups, some old and rusty, others newer and well-maintained, lined the dusty driveway. Farmers from across Owyhee County, men and women who had toiled on this land for generations, gathered with a renewed sense of purpose. Fear had given way to righteous anger, fueled by Lucas's unwavering resolve and Madeline's irrefutable evidence. Lucas stood on the makeshift porch of his warehouse, Blade faithfully at his side. He faced the assembled crowd, his face grim but determined. Vincent Rourke thought he could silence us. One by one, Lucas's voice, usually quiet, carried across the morning air with a new, commanding resonance. He thought he could poison our land, steal our livelihoods, and get away with it. But he forgot one thing. We are still here. This is our home. This is our land, and we will not let him destroy it. A roar of agreement erupted from the crowd. These were not soldiers, but their faces showed a resolve as fierce as any Lucas had seen in combat. Michael Donovan, now standing tall among his peers, stepped forward. "We follow Lucas," he declared, his voice firm. "He showed us the truth. Now we show Rourke what happens when you mess with Idaho farmers." Their target was Viridian Agrotech's main processing plant, a massive, sterile facility that stood like a monument to corporate power amidst the rolling hills. This was not a clandestine infiltration. This was an open, public challenge. Lucas, Benjamin, and Madeline had meticulously planned a legal and peaceful blockade, designed to draw maximum media attention and force the hand of authorities. As the sun climbed higher, a convoy of trucks and tractors, adorned with hand-painted signs demanding "Justice for Grayson" and "Stop the Poison," began to move. Lucas Cases led the way in his pickup, Blade sitting proudly beside him, his head held high. Benjamin and Michael rode in other vehicles, coordinating the slow, deliberate advance. When they reached the Viridian plant, the gates were already closed, guarded by a phalanx of private security personnel, looking nervous but well-armed. But instead of trying to force entry, the farmers parked their vehicles in a meticulously planned pattern, effectively blocking all ingress and egress points. They unfurled banners, chanted slogans, and stood shoulder to shoulder, a human wall of resistance. The atmosphere was charged but peaceful, a powerful, silent protest. At the same moment, miles away in a hidden location, Madeline Brooks unleashed her digital storm. She had meticulously curated every piece of evidence they had. Robert Grayson's journal entries, the unredacted Solace lab report, the encrypted emails detailing Rourke's scheme, the financial records linking him to corrupt officials, and the irrefutable proof of Michael Donovan's frame-up. She hadn't just released it to obscure agricultural forums this time. She sent it to every major news outlet, every national environmental agency, and every relevant federal investigative body in the country. "It's out," she messaged Lucas, her tone a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "All of it. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle now." The scandal erupted like a digital wildfire. National news networks, initially drawn by the peaceful blockade in rural Idaho, suddenly had a far bigger story. The images of resolute farmers standing against a corporate giant, combined with Madeline's damning evidence, painted a stark picture of environmental devastation and corporate corruption. The story of Robert Grayson's murder, initially dismissed as an accident, was now re-examined under the harsh light of a national spotlight. Calls for investigation flooded government offices. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, announced immediate, comprehensive probes into Viridian Agrotech. Back at the blockade, the arrival of news vans and helicopters underscored the national attention they had garnered. Local law enforcement, including a very grim-faced Sheriff Morgan, arrived. But this time, they were not there to arrest the farmers. Under the glare of national media, they could only stand by as the story unfolded. Hours later, the decisive blow came. Live on national television, news anchors reported that Vincent Rourke, along with several top Viridian executives, had been taken into custody by federal agents at their Boise headquarters. Charges included corporate fraud, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Morgan himself was swiftly suspended, facing an internal investigation that would inevitably lead to his own downfall. A wave of cheers erupted from the assembled farmers. Tears streamed down Michael Donovan's face as he embraced Lucas. It wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for the land, for the memory of Robert Grayson, and for every family that had been crushed by Rourke's greed. In the days that followed, the legal battles began in earnest. Viridian Agrotech crumbled under the weight of federal investigations and class action lawsuits brought by Benjamin Carter and a coalition of lawyers representing the devastated farmers. The land, once poisoned, would slowly begin the long, arduous process of healing, guided by the efforts of the community and new ethical agricultural practices. As the dust began to settle, Lucas stood on his father's charred land, the faint scent of ash still lingering, but now mixed with the promise of new growth. He had avenged his father. He had helped his community. His mission was complete. He looked at Blade, who sat faithfully by his side, his head resting on Lucas's knee. The dog had been more than just a companion. He had been a guide, a silent sentinel, a living embodiment of his father's enduring spirit. Blade had led him to the truth, and together they had brought down an empire of lies. Lucas looked out at the familiar, expansive Idaho landscape, now bathed in the gentle light of a setting sun. The land, once threatened, now had a chance to breathe again. He knew he couldn't stay. His journey had taken him down a path that was no longer just about farming. His skills, honed in the crucible of war, had found a new purpose, and he felt a pull to continue seeking out injustices wherever they might hide. With a final, lingering look at the rebuilt community, at the fields that would one day flourish again, Lucas climbed into his pickup truck. Blade, ever loyal, jumped into the passenger seat, settling in beside him. They drove away from the farm, leaving behind the newly found peace for others to nurture. Lucas Grayson and Blade, the soldier and his dog, disappeared into the fading twilight, their story becoming a whisper, a legend, a testament to the enduring power of truth and loyalty in the heart of the American prairie. Sometimes, the greatest strength isn't found in an army, but in the quiet, unbreakable bond between a soul and its most loyal companion. The story of Lucas and Blade is a testament to that simple, powerful truth. If their journey of courage and loyalty touched your heart, we invite you to share it with others who understand the power of such a spirit. Your comments, likes, and subscriptions help our community grow, allowing us to bring more tales like this to life. The journey doesn't have to end here. Another story, a new adventure, is already waiting for you on the screen now. We hope you'll join us for it.